Many cities around the capital planet were destroyed, including the central metropolis of Menumbra, the very place where the Great Council and most of the other systems governing bodies and officials worked and resided. And with that, real war began. Tensions had always existed as our species spread across the star system, an expansive group of 10 planets: Catamin, Lyrian, Aweton, and Xiran, the 4 gas giants of the outer star system; Peleus, Doru, and Rioterra, the rocky middle sector; Antirius, Menumbra, and Phania, the innermost 3, also rocky planets. This included their moons, most of which had 2 to 5 major satellites, with some planets having an additional abundance of smaller ones. It was only natural that as each planet, along with its moons, grew and recognized itself as a full-fledged colony, their leaders, the lesser planetary councils or PCs, would butt heads with the more powerful Great Council of Panihara, or GC. This dominant council, which governed the entire star system, resided on the now capital planet of Menumbra. But as more and more planets were colonized, the Great Council's influence started to stray thin. Planets started doing their own thing, finding every possible manner to defy the main council's authority. At first, it was barely noticeable and of little concern, just tiny variations in certain policies here and there. As their defiance intensified and their acts became bolder, however, the Great Council took notice and gave a stern warning to all lower councils about following system-wide laws created by the GC themselves. But their warnings were paid no heed. Rather ironically, some planets became more rebellious, blatantly disregarding the Great Council's directives. That's when the GC decided to take matters into their own hands. A team of officials from Menumbra were deployed to every planet to enforce the enactment of slackened GC laws, but this didn't sit well with some of the planetary councils. The subordinate leaders were outraged, claiming that the GC was abusing its authoritative power. From the establishment of the very first fully fledged colony, it had been agreed upon that a planet had a right of independence, even under the Great Council's jurisdiction. According to them, the GC's authoritarian actions were breaching that very right. As planetary governments and officials continued to resist, and the threat of unrest grew imminent all over the star system, the GC reconsidered its initial response and determined it was better to handle the situation in a peaceful and diplomatic manner. Realizing that their previous approach of tightening their authoritative grip was not working, there was no use risking system-wide turmoil when there might be a potentially easier, less messy route to subdue the disgruntled planets. So, the GC announced that there would be an open council at the Panihara Intersystem Chamber on Menumbra for the entire star system instead, to discuss the proper execution of the main council's laws. But even with the use of diplomacy, the planets still didn't yield. At the meeting, heated arguments portrayed just how divided the system really was. While some planetary councils agreed that following the GC's laws was crucial to maintaining peace and harmony amongst the planets, others argued that the only goal the laws were accomplishing was hindering growth. The GC's wider Panihara constitution was created based on the well-off planets of Menumbra, Tirius, and Phania, disregarding all the other planets that were not as economically inclined as they were. Some PCs even went as far as accusing the Great Council of deliberately engineering the laws that way, so that Menumbra and the gang would always be more highly developed and technologically advanced. This led to questions about the GC's transparency and where their loyalties really lay. The situation spiraled out of control as suggestions, or more so demands, were made to have the Great Council and other system-wide governing bodies, and thereby the capital, move to another planet that was not touched by said corruption, or to seize any central governing bodies at all. The GC intervened from time to time, but finally drew the line as the discussions took an unpleasant turn. They made it lucid clear that the Great Council's #1 duty was, and would always be, serving each and every planet of the Panihara star system, ensuring all planets had the opportunity to develop and thrive. They claimed this was the very foundation the Council had been established on centuries ago, when inter-system settlement had just begun bearing fruit. All they did was for the betterment of the species, and there was no better home for it than the birthplace of Quasarri. The Open Council ended with the GC declaring that there would be a re-examining of the inter-system laws, due to the obvious concerns of a majority of the planets. Until then, planetary councils were once again firmly reminded of their lawful duties to their citizens in upholding the system-wide constitution that held our civilization together and kept our species safe. But, despite their bravado, it was apparent that the GC was at least a bit shaken from the ordeal. After all, they had been, for the most part, peacefully in control of the entire star system for over 500 years. No one had ever outright opposed them before. It was no surprise then that when planets made inquiries about the Lori evaluation, the GC never gave straightforward answers, even when another system-wide open council was held at the chamber, specifically to discuss changes the different planets saw fit. The Menumbra officials were evasively secretive about what exactly they would modify, just accepting suggestions and stating they would consider it. Months later, the updated constitution was released, bringing with it a firestorm of backlash. Planets accused the GC of tweaking the laws in clever ways, making them appear favorable on paper, but in reality was a different case. The Great Council denied this, refuting their claims and declaring that PCs were being paranoid, reading a bit too much into the situation. Yet another council's meeting was held, this time involving Panihara's legislative body, which was responsible for the specifics of drafting, formalizing, and documentation of legislation, based on directives from the GC. They tried to effectively explain the newly amended laws, but planetary councils were still not satisfied, counter-arguing points and singling out loopholes. The GC had to finally take over from the overwhelmed legislative body and reassure the system, yet again, that their top priority was the well-being of all Quasarri, and concluded the meeting. But planets got even more disgruntled as more Menumbra officials, along with the Panihara official military this time, started to swarm space highways and their governing institutions. The GC had let them have their way, going through the trouble of amending Panihara's legislature to satisfy their desires. Now it was time to play by their rules, whether Quasarri liked it or not. And most didn't like it all right. But what the GC didn't account for was just how far some planets would take that animosity. The planet of Rioterra was one of the loudest voices, if not the loudest, in the entire system-wide upheaval. It was no surprise then that, soon after the Constitution was amended, they were the ones who launched a series of high-energy rockets at Menumbra without warning. Many cities around the capital planet were destroyed, including the central metropolis of Menumbra, the very place where the Great Council and most of the other systems governing bodies and officials worked and resided. And with that, real war began.